Michael Anderson had been dreaming about this trip to London for over 20 years. As a 43-year-old history teacher from a small town in Ohio, he had spent countless hours reading about British royal traditions, studying the ceremonies, and protocols that had remained unchanged for centuries. Finally, after saving money for years and carefully planning every detail, he was standing outside Buckingham Palace on a crisp October morning. The excitement in Michael's chest was almost overwhelming as he joined the crowd of tourists gathering to watch the famous changing of the guard ceremony. This wasn't just sightseeing for him, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong passion for history and tradition. He had read every book he could find about the Queen's Guard, memorized the significance of their uniforms, and studied the precise timing of their ancient rituals. Michael positioned himself near the front of the crowd, his camera ready to capture every moment of the ceremony he had waited so long to witness. Around him, hundreds of other tourists chatted excitedly in dozens of different languages. Families with children pointed at the palace gates. Elderly couples held hands as they reminisced about previous visits to London. Young backpackers compared guidebooks and shared travel stories. But Michael barely noticed the other tourists. His attention was completely focused on the palace gates, waiting for his first glimpse of the legendary guards, whose dedication to duty had become famous throughout the world. At exactly 11 o'clock, the ceremony began. The sound of marching boots on stone echoed through the palace courtyard as the Queen's Guard emerged in perfect formation. Michael felt chills running down his spine as he watched these men move with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Each guard stood exactly 6 feet tall, their red tunics perfectly pressed, their black bearskin hats positioned at identical angles. Their rifles were held with mathematical precision, and their white gloves showed no trace of dirt or wear. Every button gleamed, every buckle shone, and every piece of equipment was positioned exactly where regulations specified it should be. The guards' faces showed no expression whatsoever, stared straight ahead with eyes that seemed to see nothing and everything simultaneously. They moved as if they were parts of a single machine, each step timed to perfection, each turn executed with flawless coordination. Michael had seen videos of this ceremony online, but witnessing it in person was completely different. The weight of centuries of tradition seemed to hang in the air around these men. They weren't just soldiers performing duties, they were living representatives of an unbroken chain of service that stretched back through generations of British history. As Michael watched the guards take their positions, he found himself thinking about his own life back in Ohio. He taught American history to high school students, often seemed bored by stories of the past. They couldn't understand why old events and forgotten people should matter to their modern lives. They rolled their eyes when Michael tried to explain the importance of tradition and duty, but standing here in London, watching these guards embody centuries of disciplined service, Michael felt the power of tradition in a way that words could never convey. These men had chosen to dedicate their lives to something bigger than themselves, to maintain standards and honor commitments that had been made by countless others before them. The ceremony continued with clockwork precision. Guards were replaced at their posts with movements so smooth and coordinated that the transitions looked like choreographed dance. Commands were given in voices that carried the authority of the British Empire itself. Every gesture had meaning, every position had significance, and every moment reflected the deep respect these men held for their responsibilities. Michael took dozens of photographs, but he knew that no camera could capture what he was really experiencing. This wasn't just a tourist attraction or a performance for visitors. This was a living demonstration of what dedication looked like when it was perfected through years of training and commitment. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Michael noticed one guard in particular who seemed to embody everything he admired about this ancient tradition. The young man couldn't have been older than 25, but he carried himself with the dignity and composure of someone much more experienced. His uniform was flawless, his posture perfect, and his focus absolute. This guard, whose name Michael would later learn was James Morrison, had been serving with the Queen's Guard for 3 years. Like all his fellow guards, James had undergone months of intensive training to earn his position. He had learned to stand motionless for hours, to ignore distractions and discomfort, and to maintain perfect military bearing, regardless of weather conditions or external circumstances. James took enormous pride in his role as a Queen's Guard. Every morning, he spent an hour preparing his uniform, polishing every button and buckle until they gleamed. He practiced his movements until they became automatic, studied regulations until he knew them by heart, and maintained the physical fitness required to serve at the highest level of the British military. For James, being a Queen's Guard wasn't just a job. It was a calling that connected him to centuries of British military tradition. He understood that tourists came from around the world specifically to see him and his fellow guards maintain standards that had been upheld through wars, disasters, and social changes. The weight of that responsibility motivated him to strive for absolute perfection in everything he did. As Michael continued photographing the ceremony, he began to notice something that most tourists missed. Beyond the impressive uniforms and precise movements, there was something deeper happening with these guards. They weren't just following orders or putting on a show. They were participating in something sacred, something that transformed ordinary young men into symbols of honor and dedication. The ceremony concluded with a final inspection, where the guard commander examined each man's appearance and equipment. Michael watched in amazement as the commander found no flaws whatsoever in any guard's presentation. These men had achieved a level of excellence that seemed almost impossible in an age where people often accepted mediocrity as sufficient. As the crowds began to disperse and the guards settled into their regular duty positions, Michael felt reluctant to leave. He had traveled thousands of miles to witness this ceremony, and now that it was over, he wasn't ready to move on to the next item on his tourist itinerary. Instead, Michael decided to stay and observe the guards during their normal duty hours. He wanted to understand how they maintained their incredible standards throughout long, potentially boring shifts standing motionless at their posts. Michael positioned himself across from the palace gates, where he could watch Guard Morrison, the young man who had caught his attention during the ceremony. From this distance, Michael could study the guard's perfect posture and unwavering focus without interfering with his duties. For the first hour, Michael was impressed by Morrison's absolute stillness. The guard seemed immune to distractions that would have broken most people's concentration. Tourists took selfies just inches from his face. Children made silly gestures trying to get him to smile, and street performers created loud music nearby. Through it all, Morrison remained as motionless and expressionless as a statue. Michael began to understand why the Queen's Guard had become so famous throughout the world. These men had mastered something that most people couldn't even attempt: the ability to maintain perfect discipline and focus regardless of external circumstances. They represented the triumph of training and willpower over natural human impulses. As the second hour passed, Michael's admiration for Morrison continued to grow. The young guard's dedication seemed absolute and unshakable. No distraction could break his concentration. No discomfort could compromise his posture. And no amount of attention from tourists could alter his professional demeanor. But Michael was about to witness something that would challenge everything he thought he understood about tradition, duty, and what it means to be truly human. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen not when people follow rules perfectly, but when they must choose between following rules and following their hearts. The test of Morrison's character was approaching in the form of a small, lost child, who was about to wander into a situation that would force the guard to make an impossible choice. Between his sworn duty and his basic human compassion, the little girl couldn't have been more than 4 years old. She had curly blonde hair that bounced as she walked, and she wore a bright red coat that made her easy to spot in the crowd. But what caught Michael's attention immediately was the expression of confusion and growing panic on her small face. The child was wandering through the crowd of tourists, turning her head frantically in every direction, clearly searching for someone who wasn't there. Her lower lip was beginning to tremble, and Michael could see tears forming in her wide blue eyes. "Mummy," the little girl called out in a small, frightened voice. "Mummy, where are you?" Michael looked around quickly, expecting to see worried parents pushing through the crowd toward their lost daughter. But there was no sign of anyone looking for a missing child. The tourists continued taking photographs and chatting among themselves, apparently unaware that a 4-year-old was lost and scared. Just a few feet away from them, the little girl's panic was increasing with each passing moment. She began walking faster, bumping into adult legs and bags as she searched desperately for her mother. Her calls for Mummy became louder and more frightened. But the noise of the crowd seemed to swallow her small voice. Michael felt his protective instincts kicking in. As a teacher, he had experience helping lost and frightened children, and every fiber of his being wanted to approach the girl and offer assistance. But he hesitated because he was in a foreign country where he didn't know the proper protocols for helping lost children. He worried that approaching someone else's child might be misunderstood or cause additional problems, while Michael debated what to do. The little girl continued wandering through the crowd. Her path was taking her dangerously close to the busy street that ran alongside the palace grounds. London traffic was heavy and fast-moving. Michael realized with growing alarm that the child might wander into the road if no one intervened quickly. "Mummy," the girl cried out again, her voice now breaking with sobs. "I can't find Mummy." Several tourists noticed the crying child and looked around for her parents, but no one took direct action to help her. People seemed reluctant to get involved in a situation that wasn't clearly their responsibility, especially when they were visitors in a foreign country themselves. The little girl's wandering path brought her directly in front of Guard Morrison's post. She stopped just a few feet away from the motionless soldier, looking up at his impressive uniform and tall black hat with curiosity mixed with fear. Morrison, of course, had been trained to ignore all distractions while on duty. His orders were explicit: maintain position, remain motionless, and focus entirely on security threats to the royal family. Interacting with tourists, especially children, was strictly forbidden. Guards who broke protocol faced serious disciplinary action that could end their careers. The little girl stared at Morrison for several long moments, taking in his bright red uniform and the serious expression on his face. Despite her fear and confusion, she seemed fascinated by this soldier who stood so perfectly still. "Sir," the little girl said tentatively, reaching out as if she might touch Morrison's uniform. "Sir, I can't find my mummy. Can you help me find my mummy?" Morrison's training demanded that he continue staring straight ahead, ignoring the child completely. He had spent 3 years learning to maintain perfect discipline, regardless of circumstances. He had stood guard during thunderstorms, heat waves, and snowstorms without moving a muscle. He had ignored drunk tourists, rude comments, and countless attempts by visitors to break his concentration. But something about this little girl's plea pierced through Morrison's professional armor. The fear in her voice reminded him of his own younger sister Lucy, who used to have nightmares and would run to his room crying for protection. The child's vulnerability triggered protective instincts that Morrison had to fight against with every ounce of his willpower. Michael watched this interaction with growing concern. He could see the internal struggle playing out on Morrison's face, though the guard's expression remained officially neutral. Michael understood that the guard was caught between his duty to maintain protocol and his natural human desire to help a frightened child. The little girl began crying harder when Morrison didn't respond to her request for help. Her sobs were heartbreaking, and several tourists started looking around more urgently for her parents. But still no frantic adults appeared to claim the lost child. "Please, sir," the little girl begged Morrison, her small hands now reaching toward his perfectly polished boots. "I'm scared. I don't know where Mummy went. Please help me." Morrison's internal conflict was becoming more intense with each passing second. His military training told him to maintain position and ignore the distraction. His commander's voice echoed in his memory, warning that any breach of protocol would result in immediate removal from the guard. Morrison had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to earn his position, to risk losing it over a momentary lapse in discipline. But the child's increasingly desperate cries were breaking down Morrison's professional defenses. Every instinct he possessed as a decent human being was screaming at him to abandon his post and help this frightened little girl find her mother. Michael could see the struggle intensifying on Morrison's face. The guard's jaw was tightly clenched, and his eyes showed the strain of someone fighting against his own compassionate nature. Michael realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when centuries of military tradition collided with basic human empathy. The little girl, growing more desperate as her pleas were ignored, made a decision that would force Morrison's hand. She stepped closer to the guard and wrapped her small arms around his leg, hugging him tightly as she sobbed against his perfectly pressed uniform. "Please don't leave me alone," she whispered through her tears. "I'm scared and I want my mummy." This physical contact created an impossible situation for Morrison. Protocol demanded that he remain completely motionless, but the child's embrace made movement unavoidable. He could either push her away, which would be cruel and potentially harmful, or acknowledge her presence, which would violate his orders. Michael held his breath as he watched Morrison make his choice. The guard's entire body seemed to tremble. With the effort of deciding between duty and compassion, sweat appeared on his forehead despite the cool October weather. And his hands, which had remained perfectly steady through years of service, began to shake slightly. The crowd of tourists had grown quiet as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Most of them had come to see the famous Queen's Guard as symbols of British tradition and discipline. None of them had expected to see such a dramatic test of a guard's humanity. Morrison looked down at the little girl clinging to his leg. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside him. He saw not a distraction from his duties, but a child who needed protection, which was, after all, the deepest purpose behind everything the Queen's Guard represented. Very slowly, Morrison moved his white-gloved hand and gently placed it on the little girl's head, stroking her curly blonde hair with infinite tenderness. "It's all right, sweetheart," Morrison said quietly, his voice gentle but steady. "We're going to find your mummy. I promise you don't have to be scared anymore." The crowd gasped audibly at this breach of protocol. Guards weren't supposed to speak during duty hours, and they certainly weren't supposed to interact physically with members of the public. Morrison had just violated multiple regulations in front of hundreds of witnesses, but something magical happened in response to Morrison's compassion. Instead of chaos or criticism, the crowd began working together to help solve the child's problem. Tourists started calling out descriptions of the lost little girl, hoping to attract her mother's attention. People began searching the surrounding area more systematically, organizing themselves into groups to cover more ground efficiently. Michael felt tears forming in his eyes as he watched this unexpected display of human kindness. He had come to London expecting to admire the cold perfection of military tradition. But instead, he was witnessing something far more powerful, the moment when tradition and emotion came together to create something beautiful. Morrison, meanwhile, was experiencing the most difficult moment of his career. He knew that his actions would likely result in serious disciplinary action. He might lose his position, face military charges, or be discharged from service entirely. 3 years of perfect service could be destroyed by this single moment of compassion. But as Morrison felt the little girl's tight grip on his leg and heard her sobs beginning to quiet, he realized that some things were more important than regulations. The Queen's Guard existed to protect people, and right now, this frightened child needed protection more than the palace needed another motionless statue. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Morrison asked the little girl, his voice carrying easily over the now quiet crowd. "Emma," the child whispered, looking up at Morrison with trust and hope replacing the fear in her eyes. "My name is Emma, and I was looking at the pretty horses with Mummy, but then I turned around and she was gone." Morrison nodded understandingly. "Emma is a beautiful name. I'm James, and I'm going to help you find your mummy. But first, I need you to stay right here with me where it's safe, okay?" Emma nodded, still holding tightly to Morrison's leg, but no longer crying. The simple act of having an adult acknowledge her problem and promise to help had transformed her from a panicked child into a trusting one. Michael watched this interaction with growing amazement. He had expected to see tradition and protocol demonstrated with mechanical perfection. Instead, he was witnessing the highest form of service, the willingness to risk everything to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. Unknown to anyone in the crowd, Emma's mother Jennifer was frantically searching for her daughter. 3 blocks away, having become separated when Emma wandered off to get a closer look at some mounted police horses. Jennifer was calling Emma's name and describing her to every police officer and security guard she could find. growing more terrified with each passing minute. The search was about to become much more complicated because Morrison's breach of protocol had not gone unnoticed by his superiors. The guard commander was already walking briskly toward Morrison's post, his expression stern and his intention clear. Morrison's act of compassion was about to be tested by the very system he had sworn to serve. Commander William Sterling had been observing the situation from his position inside the palace gates. At 58 years old, Sterling had dedicated his entire adult life to maintaining the highest standards of the Queen's Guard. He had served for 35 years, working his way up from a young recruit to the most senior position in the unit. Sterling was known throughout the military for his unwavering commitment to discipline and protocol. He had never tolerated breaches of conduct regardless of circumstances or intentions. In his view, the Queen's Guard's reputation for excellence depended entirely on every member's absolute adherence to regulations. One moment of weakness or emotional decision-making could undermine decades of carefully maintained tradition. As Sterling approached Morrison's post, his face showed the stern disapproval that had intimidated countless soldiers over the years. The crowd of tourists sensed the tension immediately and grew quiet, realizing they were about to witness a confrontation between authority and compassion. "Guard Morrison," Sterling said in a voice that carried the weight of military law. "Step away from the civilian immediately and resume your proper position." Morrison felt his heart racing as he heard his commander's order. He knew he was in serious trouble, but he also knew that little Emma was still clinging to his leg, trusting him to keep her safe. Looking down at her small, frightened face, Morrison made a decision that surprised even himself. "Sir," Morrison replied, respectfully but firmly, "I cannot abandon this child until her mother is located. She is in potential danger, and my duty is to protect people." The crowd murmured at Morrison's defiance of direct orders. Even tourists unfamiliar with military protocol could understand that a subordinate was refusing to obey his superior officer. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Commander Sterling's expression hardened. "Guard Morrison, your duty is to follow orders, not to make independent decisions about when to break protocol. Release the child immediately and return to position, or face immediate disciplinary action." Michael felt his stomach churning as he watched this confrontation unfold. He could see both sides of the conflict clearly. Sterling was right that military discipline required absolute obedience to orders. But Morrison was also right that protecting innocent people was the ultimate purpose behind all military service. Emma, meanwhile, had picked up on the tension between the two soldiers. She looked up at Morrison with worried eyes, sensing that her protector might be in trouble because of her. "James," Emma whispered, using the name Morrison had given her, "are you going to get in trouble because you're helping me?" Morrison looked down at Emma, then back at his commander, weighing the consequences of his choice. He could obey Sterling's order and return to his post, leaving Emma alone and scared in the crowd. This would preserve his career and maintain military discipline. Or he could continue protecting Emma and face whatever punishment Sterling decided to impose. "Emma," Morrison said gently, "sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices about what's right and what's safe. I'm going to make sure you find your mummy, even if it causes problems for me." Sterling's face flushed with anger at Morrison's continued disobedience. "Guard Morrison, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Report to my office for disciplinary proceedings after you are replaced at this post." But before Morrison could respond, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Michael Anderson, the history teacher from Ohio who had been silently observing everything, stepped forward from the crowd and addressed Commander Sterling directly. "Excuse me, sir," Michael said politely, "but clearly, I'm a visitor from America, and I've been watching your guards all morning. I came here because I've studied British military traditions for years, and I wanted to see them demonstrated in person." Sterling looked at Michael with surprise and slight irritation. Civilians didn't typically interrupt military disciplinary proceedings, and Sterling wasn't sure how to handle this intervention. "This is a military matter," Sterling replied curtly. "Please return to the tourist area." But Michael continued speaking. his voice growing stronger as he found his courage. "Sir, I need you to know that what I witnessed here today was the most impressive display of military honor I've ever seen. Your guard Morrison didn't break tradition, he embodied the highest tradition of all." Sterling's eyebrows raised at this unexpected interpretation. "Explain yourself." Michael gestured toward Morrison and Emma, who were still standing together while the little girl held on to the guard's leg. "The greatest military tradition isn't about following orders blindly. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Your guard saw a child in danger and chose to fulfill his deepest duty, even when it conflicted with his immediate orders." The crowd began murmuring approvingly at Michael's words. Many tourists were nodding in agreement, moved by his passionate defense of Morrison's actions. Throughout history, Michael continued, his teaching background helping him articulate his thoughts clearly, the most honored soldiers haven't been those who followed rules most perfectly. They've been those who understood the spirit behind the rules and acted accordingly when faced with impossible choices. Sterling found himself listening carefully to Michael's argument. The American's obvious respect for military tradition gave weight to his words, and his interpretation of Morrison's actions reframed the entire situation. Furthermore, Michael added, "I've been watching your guards for hours. I can tell you that every tourist here has been impressed not just by their discipline, but by their humanity, the fact that your guards care enough about people to risk their careers protecting children. That's what makes them truly special." Emma, who had been listening to this adult conversation with the intense attention that children give to discussions about their own welfare, looked up at Commander Sterling with hopeful eyes. "Sir," Emma said in her small, clear voice, "James promised to help me find my mummy. Are you going to stop him from keeping his promise?" The question hit Sterling like a physical blow. In all his years of military service, he had prided himself on being a man of honor who kept his word. The idea that he might prevent another soldier from keeping a promise to a frightened child challenged his understanding of what honor really meant. Before Sterling could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Emma. Emma, sweetheart." A woman came running through the crowd, pushing past tourists and calling frantically for her daughter. Jennifer Wilson, Emma's mother, had been searching for 15 terrifying minutes, growing more panicked with each moment that passed without finding her child. "Mummy," Emma cried joyfully, finally releasing her grip on Morrison's leg and running toward her mother's outstretched arms. Jennifer scooped Emma up and held her tightly, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Oh, sweetheart, I was so scared. I looked everywhere for you. How did you end up over here?" Emma pointed proudly toward Morrison. "That soldier helped me, Mummy. His name is James, and he promised to keep me safe until you came back. He's very nice, even though he has to stand very still for his job." Jennifer looked at Morrison with overwhelming gratitude. As a mother, she understood exactly how dangerous the situation could have been. If her daughter had continued wandering alone through the crowded streets of London. "Thank you," Jennifer said to Morrison, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for protecting my daughter when I couldn't." Morrison nodded politely, but his attention remained focused on Commander Sterling, waiting to learn the consequences of his decision to break protocol. Sterling stood silently for several long moments, processing everything that had occurred. He was witnessing the reunion of a mother and child who might have been separated permanently if not for Morrison's intervention. The joy and relief on their faces made it impossible to view Morrison's actions as simple disobedience. Moreover, the crowd of international tourists had been deeply moved by Morrison's compassion. Sterling could see in their faces that their respect for the Queen's Guard had increased rather than decreased because of Morrison's breach of protocol. "Guard Morrison," Sterling said finally, his voice carrying a tone that Morrison couldn't interpret. Morrison stood at attention, prepared to accept whatever punishment his commander deemed appropriate. "Yes, sir." Sterling's next words would surprise everyone present and change how the Queen's Guard approached the balance between tradition and humanity. Commander Sterling looked at the crowd of tourists, then at Emma safe in her mother's arms, then back at Guard Morrison standing at attention. The weight of 35 years of military service and the responsibility of maintaining centuries-old traditions pressed heavily on his shoulders. Guard Morrison, Sterling said slowly, his voice carrying a gravity that silenced the entire crowd. In my 35 years of service, I have never encountered a situation quite like this one. Morrison remained perfectly still, prepared for whatever consequences his commander would impose. The tourists held their breath, wondering whether they were about to witness a good man being punished for doing the right thing. When I took command of this unit, Sterling continued, I swore an oath to uphold the traditions and honor of the Queen's Guard. I believed that meant enforcing every regulation without exception, maintaining discipline through absolute adherence to protocol. Michael felt his heart sinking, convinced that Sterling was about to make an example of Morrison to demonstrate that compassion had no place in military service. But Sterling's next words surprised everyone present. However, Sterling said, his stern expression softening slightly, I have been reminded today that the Queen's Guard exists not to serve regulations, but to serve people. Our traditions have meaning only insofar as they help us fulfill our ultimate duty, protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Morrison's eyes widened with surprise and cautious hope. Was his commander actually defending his decision too? Help, Emma. Sterling turned to address the crowd of tourists directly. Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed something today that represents the true spirit of the Queen's Guard. Guard Morrison chose to risk his career to protect a child in danger. This is not a violation of our traditions. This is the highest expression of what our traditions represent. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, moved by Sterling's unexpected wisdom and leadership. Jennifer hugged Emma tighter, tears of gratitude streaming down her face as she realized that the soldier who had protected her daughter was being honored rather than punished. Michael felt tears forming in his own eyes. Someone who had studied military history for decades, he understood the profound significance of what Sterling was doing. The commander was demonstrating that true leadership meant knowing when to apply rules flexibly in service of higher principles. Guard Morrison, Sterling continued, you are hereby commended for exceptional service above and beyond the call of duty. Your actions today exemplify the finest traditions of the British military: courage, compassion, and commitment to protecting innocent people. Morrison struggled to maintain his composure as relief and pride washed over him. He had prepared himself for court-martial proceedings and possible dismissal from service. Instead, he was being praised for the very actions he had thought would end his career. Emma, meanwhile, had been listening to this adult conversation with the intense focus that children bring to discussions about their heroes. She wiggled in her mother's arms until Jennifer put her down, then ran back to Morrison and hugged his leg again. James, Emma said happily, I'm glad you're not in trouble for helping me. You're the best soldier in the whole world. Act. Morrison knelt down to Emma's level, bringing his face close to hers so they could speak eye to eye. Emma, I want you to remember something important. The best people are those who help others when they need help, even if it's difficult or scary. You were very brave today, and I was honored to help you. Jennifer approached Morrison and extended her hand in gratitude. I don't know how to thank you properly. As a mother, I can't imagine what might have happened if you hadn't been here to protect Emma. Ma'am, Morrison replied, shaking Jennifer's hand respectfully. Protecting people like Emma is why I became a guard in the first place. I'm just grateful everything worked out safely. Commander Sterling watched this interaction with growing satisfaction. He was seeing firsthand how Morrison's compassionate action had created positive ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The tourists were more impressed with the Queen's Guard than ever before. Emma had learned valuable lessons about kindness and bravery, and Jennifer had experienced the best of British hospitality and protection. Michael stepped forward to address both Morrison and Sterling. Gentlemen, I came to London as a tourist hoping to observe your famous traditions. Instead, I witnessed something much more valuable, a demonstration of how traditions stay alive by adapting to serve human needs rather than just following ancient rules. Sterling nodded approvingly at Michael's observation. Sir, your words during our confrontation helped me remember why these traditions exist in the first place. Military discipline serves no purpose if it prevents us from fulfilling our mission to protect people. What you both showed me today, Michael continued, is that the strongest traditions are those that can bend without breaking, that can honor the past while serving the present. The crowd of tourists began approaching Morrison to thank him personally and take photographs with the guard who had shown such remarkable compassion. Morrison found himself surrounded by people from around the world who wanted to express their admiration for his character. An elderly Japanese man bowed respectfully to Morrison. "In my country, we understand the importance of duty and honor. What you did today showed both in perfect balance." A young mother from Germany approached with her own small daughter. "My little girl was watching everything that happened. She wants to know if there are more soldiers like you who would help children who are lost." Morrison smiled at the German child, who was hiding shyly behind her mother's leg. "There are good people everywhere who will help you if you need it. Important thing is to be kind to others, so they want to help you too." Emma, who had been watching all the attention Morrison was receiving, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, can we come back tomorrow to see James again?" Jennifer laughed at her daughter's request. "I think James has work to do, sweetheart, but maybe we can visit again sometime." Commander Sterling overheard this conversation and made an impulsive decision that surprised even himself. "Mrs. Wilson, if you and Emma would like to return tomorrow, I'll arrange for a special tour of the palace grounds. Emma can meet some of our horses and learn more about what the guards do." Emma's face lit up with excitement. "Really? I can see the horses and learn about being a soldier?" "Well," Sterling said with the first smile anyone had seen from him all day, "you can certainly learn about helping people and being brave, which are the most important parts of being a good soldier." As the crowd began to disperse and normal tourist activities resumed, Michael remained near Morrison's post. He felt that he had witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A perfect example of how human decency could enhance rather than compromise professional excellence. "Guard Morrison," Michael said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what made you decide to risk everything to help Emma? You must have known you could face serious consequences." Morrison considered the question thoughtfully. "Sir, I've spent 3 years learning to stand perfectly still and ignore distractions. But when I looked at that little girl's frightened face, I realized that protecting her was exactly what all my training had been preparing me for. Standing still is just practice for the moments when you need to move towards someone who needs help." Michael nodded, struck by the wisdom in Morrison's simple explanation. "I teach high school students back in America. Many of them think tradition and rules are just ways to limit their freedom. What you showed me today is that the best traditions actually create freedom, the freedom to do the right thing even when it's difficult." "I never thought about it that way," Morrison replied, "but I think you're right. All the discipline and training we do isn't meant to make us robots. It's meant to make us strong enough to help people when they really need it." As the afternoon wore on, Michael found himself in conversations with other tourists who had witnessed the morning's events. The story was already spreading among visitors to London, and many people were saying it had changed their understanding of what military service really meant. But the most important conversation was yet to come, one that would occur that evening. When Commander Sterling briefed his superiors about the day's events and proposed changes to Queen's Guard protocols that would honor both tradition and compassion, the ripple effects of Morrison's simple act of kindness were just beginning to spread throughout the British military establishment. That evening, Commander Sterling sat in his office preparing the most important report of his military career. The events of the day had forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about leadership, tradition, and the true purpose of military service. Sterling had always believed that maintaining discipline required strict enforcement of every regulation, regardless of circumstances. But Morrison's compassionate response to Emma's crisis had demonstrated something. Sterling had never fully understood before that the highest form of discipline was knowing when rules should serve humanity rather than the other way around. As Sterling wrote his report, he reflected on the crowd's reaction to Morrison's actions. The tourists hadn't been disappointed or confused by the breach of protocol. Instead, they had been inspired and moved by witnessing genuine compassion in action. The respect for the Queen's Guard had actually increased because they had seen evidence that these men were not just ceremonial figures, but real people committed to protecting others. Sterling's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller was General Patricia Hayes, his immediate superior and one of the most respected leaders in the British military. "William," General Hayes said without preamble. "I've been receiving calls all afternoon about an incident involving one of your guards and a lost child. The story is already appearing on social media and news websites around the world. I need to understand exactly what happened." Sterling took a deep breath and began explaining the day's events in detail. He described Morrison's initial adherence to protocol, Emma's desperate situation, and the guard's decision to risk his career to protect a frightened child. "The guard deliberately disobeyed direct orders?" General Hayes asked, her tone suggesting serious concern. "Yes, ma'am," Sterling replied. "But I believe his actions represented the highest form of military service. He chose to fulfill our ultimate mission of protecting people even when it conflicted with immediate regulations." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sterling waited nervously, knowing that his own career might be in jeopardy depending on how his superiors viewed his decision to commend rather than punish Morrison. "William," General Hayes said finally, "I want you to know that the Queen herself has been briefed on this incident. Her Majesty specifically requested that I convey her personal gratitude to Guard Morrison for his exemplary service." Sterling felt relief flooding through him. "Ma'am, the Queen believes that Morrison's actions today exemplified the finest traditions of British military service," General Hayes explained. "She has asked me to review our protocols to ensure that guards are empowered to provide assistance in emergency situations involving children or other vulnerable people." This news exceeded Sterling's wildest hopes. Not only was Morrison being protected from punishment, but the incident was inspiring positive changes throughout the entire military structure. "There's more," General Hayes continued. "The story has been picked up by international media, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. People around the world are praising the British military for producing soldiers who combine traditional discipline with modern compassion." Sterling smiled as he realized the full implications of what had occurred. Morrison's moment of choice between protocol and compassion had become a public relations triumph that showcased the best aspects of British military culture. Meanwhile, across London, Michael Anderson was sitting in his hotel room writing in the travel journal he had been keeping throughout his trip. But instead of describing tourist attractions and historical sites, he was trying to capture the profound impact of witnessing Morrison's crisis of conscience. "Today I learned something that no history book could have taught me," Michael wrote. "I saw tradition and emotion come together in a way that made both stronger rather than weaker." Guard Morrison didn't abandon his duties. He discovered what his duties really meant. Michael had originally planned to spend several more days in London visiting museums and historical sites, but the morning's events had given him everything he had hoped to find in his travels: a deep understanding of how principles and compassion could work together to create something beautiful. The next morning, Michael returned to Buckingham Palace, not as a tourist hoping to observe distant traditions, but as someone who had become personally connected to the people who maintained those traditions. Jennifer and Emma Wilson were already there, having arrived early for the special tour that Commander Sterling had promised. Emma wore a small toy soldier uniform that Jennifer had bought for her. She carried a hand-drawn picture she had made for Morrison. "Mummy," Emma said excitedly as they approached the palace gates, "do you think James will remember me?" "Think he'll definitely remember you, sweetheart," Jennifer replied with a smile. "You made quite an impression on him yesterday." Morrison saw Emma approaching in her toy uniform. His serious guard expression broke into the warmest smile the tourists had ever seen from a Queen's Guard member. "Emma," Morrison called out, temporarily abandoning his stoic demeanor, "you look like a proper soldier in that uniform." Emma beamed with pride and ran up to Morrison, handing him her drawing. The picture showed a tall figure in a red uniform, holding hands with a small figure in a red coat, both of them smiling under a bright yellow sun. "I drew this for you," Emma announced. "It's you and me being friends, and we're both happy because we helped each other." Morrison accepted the drawing with genuine emotion, knowing that it would become one of his most treasured possessions. "Emma, this is the most beautiful picture anyone has ever given me. I'm going to keep it forever." Commander Sterling approached the group, but his demeanor was completely different from the stern authority figure he had been the day before. He was smiling warmly and carrying a small gift bag. "Emma," Sterling said, kneeling down to her level, "I have something special for you. It's a miniature Queen's Guard bear that's wearing the same uniform as James." Emma accepted the gift with wide-eyed wonder, hugging the small bear tightly against her chest. "Thank you. I'll take very good care of him." "I know you will," Sterling replied. "I want you to know that whenever you see a Queen's Guard, whether it's a real one like James or a toy one like your bear, you should remember that their job is to help people like you feel safe and protected." Michael watched this exchange with deep satisfaction. He was seeing the continuation of yesterday's lesson that tradition was strongest when it remained connected to its human purpose. The special tour that Sterling provided was unlike anything Emma or her mother could have imagined. They visited the guard quarters, learned about the training process, and even met some of the famous horses that were part of the royal ceremonies. But the most meaningful part of the tour came when Sterling gathered all the guards together to hear Emma tell the story of how Morrison had helped her. James was standing very still like he was supposed to. Emma explained to the assembled guards, but when I told him I was scared and lost, he decided that helping me was more important than standing still. He kept me safe until my mummy came back. The guards listened to Emma's account with serious attention, understanding that they were hearing about a moment that had redefined what it meant to serve with honor. Emma, Sterling said after she finished her story, "You taught all of us something very important yesterday. You showed us that the best traditions are the ones that help people, not the ones that ignore people's problems." As the tour concluded, Michael realized that his role in the previous day's events had been more significant than he had initially understood. His defense of Morrison's actions had helped Sterling see the situation from a new perspective, contributing to the positive outcome for everyone involved. "Mr. Anderson," Sterling said as the group prepared to leave, "I want to thank you for your words yesterday. Your perspective helped me understand that defending tradition doesn't always mean enforcing rules rigidly. Sometimes it means understanding the spirit behind the rules." Michael felt honored by Sterling's acknowledgement. "Commander, what I witnessed yesterday will change how I teach my students about military service and civic duty. You and Morrison showed me that the best traditions are living things that grow stronger when they're guided by compassion." Before leaving the palace, Emma insisted on saying goodbye to Morrison personally. She approached his post with the confident stride of someone who knew she was among friends. "James," Emma said, looking up at the tall guard with complete trust, "thank you for being my friend and keeping me safe. When I grow up, I want to help people just like you do." Morrison knelt down once more to speak with Emma at her level. "Emma, you're already helping people by being kind and brave. The way you trusted me yesterday helped me remember why I wanted to become a guard in the first place." As Jennifer and Emma walked away from the palace, hand in hand and chatting excitedly about everything they had seen, Michael lingered for a few more moments to observe Morrison returning to his duties. The guard resumed his position with perfect posture and unwavering focus. But something fundamental had changed about his presence. He no longer seemed like a cold statue maintaining meaningless protocol. Instead, he appeared as a living symbol of service, someone who stood ready to protect anyone who might need protection. Michael understood that he had witnessed the birth of a new kind of tradition, one that honored the past while remaining flexible enough to serve the present. Morrison's choice to help Emma had demonstrated that the strongest military traditions were those that enhanced rather than suppressed the humanity of the people who served them. The story of the Queen's Guard who broke protocol to help a lost child was about to spread far beyond London, inspiring conversations about duty, compassion, and leadership in military organizations around the world. 3 years later, the story of Guard Morrison and little Emma had become legendary, far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. Military academies around the world used their interaction as a case study in ethical leadership and situational decision-making. The incident had sparked important conversations about when rules should be followed absolutely and when they should be interpreted in service of higher principles. Michael Anderson had returned to his classroom in Ohio with a completely transformed understanding of how to teach history and civic responsibility. Instead of focusing solely on dates, battles, and political decisions, he now emphasized the human moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices that shaped the course of events. History isn't just about what happened, Michael told his students. It's about why people chose to act the way they did when they faced difficult decisions. Every tradition we study today exists because someone, somewhere, decided that certain values were worth preserving and protecting. His students were captivated by the story of Morrison and Emma, which Michael used to illustrate how individual moments of courage and compassion could influence entire institutions. The story helped them understand that they too had the power to shape history through their own choices about how to treat others. Michael had stayed in contact with Morrison through email, developing an unlikely friendship between an American teacher and a British guard. Their correspondence had evolved into a broader collaboration on military ethics and community service that influenced policies in both countries. Morrison himself had been promoted twice since the Emo incident, eventually becoming a training instructor for new Queen's Guard recruits. His approach to teaching emphasized not just technical skills and protocol adherence, but also the importance of understanding why traditions existed and how to apply them wisely in unexpected situations. Being a Queen's Guard means more than following orders perfectly, Morrison told his trainees during orientation sessions. It means being ready to make good decisions when you encounter situations that no regulation could have anticipated. Morrison's training methods produced guards who were not only technically excellent, but also capable of thinking independently and acting compassionately. When circumstances required it, the Queen's Guard developed a reputation for being both disciplined and humane, attracting recruits who wanted to serve in a unit that valued both tradition and moral courage. Emma Wilson, now 7 years old, had never forgotten her encounter with Morrison. The experience had shaped her understanding of bravery, kindness, and what it meant to help others in need. She often told her friends at school about her soldier friend James, who had protected her when she was scared and lost. Jennifer had used the story to teach Emma important lessons about trusting good people while staying safe around strangers. Remember, Jennifer would tell her daughter, James helped you because he was wearing a uniform that showed he was safe to trust. And because you were in a public place where other people could see what was happening. The impact of that October morning extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Commander Sterling had worked with military leaders throughout the British Armed Forces to develop new guidelines that balanced strict discipline with situational awareness and human compassion. These guidelines, which became known as the Morrison Protocols, gave soldiers explicit permission to break minor regulations when doing so was necessary to protect innocent people. The protocols required soldiers to use their judgment wisely, but they also protected them from punishment when they made good faith efforts to help others. The British military's adoption of these protocols influenced similar changes in Allied forces around the world. Military leaders began recognizing that the most effective soldiers were those who could think independently while maintaining their commitment to service and duty. Michael had documented these developments in a book he wrote about his London experience, titled When Tradition Meets Compassion, Lessons from Buckingham Palace. The book became required reading in several military leadership programs and was translated into multiple languages. On the 3rd anniversary of the original incident, Michael returned to London for a special ceremony honoring Morrison's service and the positive changes his actions had inspired. The ceremony took place in the same courtyard where Emma had first asked for help, but this time it was attended by military leaders, government officials, and education specialists from around the world. Emma and Jennifer were special guests. At the ceremony, Emma, now confident and articulate, was asked to speak about how Morrison's kindness had influenced her own desire to help others. When I was little and scared, Emma told the assembled crowd, James showed me that the most important job anyone can have is taking care of people who need help. He taught me that being strong means using your strength to protect people who aren't as strong as you are. Emma's words resonated with the international audience, many of whom were military leaders struggling to balance traditional discipline with modern expectations about compassion and emotional intelligence. Morrison, now a sergeant and training commander, was presented with a special commendation from the Queen herself. But the honor that meant the most to him was Emma's presence at the ceremony and her continued friendship over the years. "Your Majesty," Morrison said as he accepted his commendation, "3 years ago I thought I had to choose between following orders and helping a child. What I learned that day was that the best traditions are those that make following your conscience and following your duty the same thing." The Queen smiled at Morrison's words. "Sergeant Morrison, your actions that day reminded all of us that military service at its finest is about protecting what we value most, the innocence, safety, and well-being of our people." After the ceremony, Michael had the opportunity to speak privately with Morrison about how the Guard's split-second decision had influenced so many lives. James Michael said, "When I first came to London, I was looking for examples of how tradition could remain unchanged in a changing world. Instead, you showed me something better, how tradition could evolve while keeping its essential spirit alive." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Anderson, I think what we learned together is that the strongest traditions are the ones that help people become the best versions of themselves. Emma needed protection, Commander Sterling needed to remember why our rules exist, and I needed to discover what kind of man I really wanted to be." "And now?" Michael asked. "Now I know that standing guard isn't about being a statue," Morrison replied with a smile. "It's about being ready to move toward anyone who needs help whenever they need it." As Michael prepared to return to America, once again, he reflected on how a simple tourist trip had become a life-changing experience. He had expected to observe historical traditions from a distance, but instead he had become part of a moment that would influence military training and ethical leadership for years to come. Emma ran up to Michael as he was saying goodbye. Carrion, the same toy soldier bear that Commander Sterling had given her 3 years earlier. "Mr. Michael," Emma said, "James told me that you helped him not get in trouble for being nice to me. Thank you for standing up for people who do the right thing." Michael knelt down to Emma's level, just as Morrison had done that first day. "You've taught all of us that the most important traditions are the ones that protect children like you. You made everyone remember what really matters." As Michael boarded his flight back to Ohio, he carried with him more than souvenirs and photographs. He carried the knowledge that he had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when tradition and emotion had come together to create positive change that would ripple through institutions and lives for generations to come. The story of Morrison, Emma, and the choice between protocol and compassion had become more than just an interesting anecdote. It had become a teaching tool, an inspiration, and a reminder that the most powerful traditions are those that help ordinary people do extraordinary things when the moment calls for courage and kindness. Back at Buckingham Palace, Morrison continued his duties with the same precision and dedication he had always shown. But now his service carried additional meaning. He knew that every tourist who watched him stand guard was seeing not just a symbol of British tradition, but a reminder that the best traditions are those that enhance our humanity rather than diminish it. The unexpected moment that connected a tourist to a royal guard had grown into something that connected people around the world to a deeper understanding of what service, sacrifice, and compassion really meant. And it all began with a 4-year-old girl's simple request for help, and a soldier's decision that some things are more important than following orders.